Below these waves, an island sleeps. The Atlantic wind moves across volcanic cliffs, and the sound unsettles. The sea is both stage and eraser. It keeps some things, lets others go. An ROV camera rises from dark water. Coral gardens pass. Bacterial mats glow faintly in the artificial light. Then the flat summit appears, strewn with sand ripples as if a shore had simply sunk and frozen in place. In that rising is a question that will not leave us. What does the ocean remember?
Welcome to Unexplained History. I'm Tom Mackenzie, and over the next hour, we're diving deep into a mystery that sits somewhere between science, geography, and one of humanity's oldest stories. Stick with us.
In 2011, a Spanish research vessel called the IGME set out into the Atlantic west of the Canary Islands. They were mapping the seafloor with high-resolution cameras and sonar equipment, routine oceanographic work. What they found sparked something unexpected. A seamount rose from the deep, its summit relatively flat and marked by features that looked remarkably like ancient beaches and dunes. Scientists called it Los Atlantes. Journalists noticed the name, then noticed the shape, and suddenly the discovery was being linked to something far older than marine geology.
Atlantis.
The name carries weight. It carries millennia of weight. For centuries, people have searched for the island Plato described in his dialogues, a sophisticated civilization that vanished into the sea in a single day and night. Some saw it as metaphor. Others saw it as a lost historical record waiting to be recovered. When photographs of Los Atlantes began circulating, a familiar conversation reignited. Had explorers finally found something real? Had a sunken summit with sand ripples suddenly become proof of an ancient legend? Luis Somoza was one of the scientists aboard that ship. He found himself quoted in international headlines. His preliminary observations transformed into headlines about mythic islands. The discovery was preliminary. The data was still being analyzed. But the story moved faster than the science. Luis had to manage expectations. Among his team, among journalists hungry for the next angle, and among Canary Island communities watching their own history become part of a global speculation machine.
Luis started spending more time drafting careful statements before speaking publicly, prioritizing peer review and clear timelines for publication. The pressure had changed how he worked.
The Guanche people, the indigenous inhabitants of the Canary Islands before Spanish conquest, became part of this story too. Online, some began claiming the Guanche were direct descendants or survivors of Plato's advanced Atlantean civilization. The claim circulates without evidence, but it carries real weight for how island heritage is remembered and who gets to narrate it. A sunken seamount, viewed through the lens of an ancient myth, had become entangled with questions of ancestry, identity, and cultural ownership. This is where science and imagination meet, not always easily. A geological feature can look like something from a story. That resemblance can spark wonder, curiosity, and connection to the past. But it can also blur the line between discovery and assumption, between what we find and what we want to find.
So, here's the question we're sitting with. If a sunken summit looks like a drowned shore, does that make the island in Plato's dialogue suddenly real? We've just seen a geological formation on the ocean floor, a shape that invites comparison to something lost. But before we search the seafloor, we need to go back much further. We need to return to ancient Athens, to a philosopher's classroom, where an island story began as a thought experiment. Let's talk about Plato, and why his words would echo through 25 centuries of maps, obsessions, and discoveries.
Imagine a candlelit room in classical Athens. The year is around 360 BCE. A teacher sits with students posing a question: what would a perfect society look like? What would bring it to greatness? And what would tear it down? That teacher was Plato, and the answer he crafted was not a blueprint for a city. It was a story. He described an island called Atlantis, located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar. On this island lived a society grown powerful through trade and military might. They built temples and harbors. They prospered. And then, in a single day and night, they were swallowed by the sea.
The question is, did Plato believe this island actually existed?
Most scholars would say no. Plato was writing philosophical dialogues, conversations designed to test ideas, not travelogues or maps. His island served a purpose. It was a mirror. By imagining a society that rose through ambition and fell through hubris, Plato was teaching his readers about power and moral consequence. He was asking them to think about what destroys civilizations from within. The two works containing this story, the Timaeus and the Critias, are part of a larger philosophical project. Plato uses invented places and narratives repeatedly across his writings to test ethical arguments. He was deliberately crafting stories that could be inhabited by the imagination, then discarded once the lesson was learned. The island was a tool, not a claim about geography. And yet, and this is crucial, Plato was provocative. He placed Atlantis in a real direction. He gave it spatial language. He said it lay beyond known boundaries. He described its destruction as historical, something that happened long before his own time. The very ambiguity in how he framed it left later readers wondering, did he know something? Was this allegory, or was it fact wrapped in philosophy?
That ambiguity became the seed. Over centuries, people would return to Plato's words looking for clues, treating a classroom example as if it were a map waiting to be decoded.
In Plato's time, the phrase "beyond the Pillars of Hercules" meant simply beyond the known world. It was shorthand for mystery and distance. But when later scholars, explorers, and dreamers returned to these dialogues, they began to take the geography literally. Victorian atlas makers would draw Atlantis as a possible location. Scientists would search the Atlantic basin. Every submarine ridge or volcanic anomaly became a potential match to Plato's description. The classroom example had mutated into a quest.
So here is the question we face. How did a philosophical parable become a map? How did rhetoric transform into geography? In 2011, a research vessel positioned itself over the Atlantic seafloor east of Lanzarote. What the instruments recorded that day would spark a chain of headlines and test the boundaries between discovery and interpretation. This is the story of how one seamount became a cipher for myth.
The Geological and Mining Institute of Spain, known by its Spanish acronym IGME, coordinates a large research initiative called the Atlantis Project. Their work spans the seafloor around the Canary Islands, mapping submarine formations and understanding the geological history of the region. During one research cruise, their instruments detected a seamount, an underwater mountain, lying about 300 kilometers east of Lanzarote. They named it Los Atlantes. Los Atlantes is not small. It rises from the deep ocean floor and has 3 volcanic peaks. all now inactive, all slowly eroding over millennia. What made this seamount noteworthy to the wider world, though, wasn't the volcanoes themselves. It was what covered their summits.
And what exactly did they find?
When the research team examined the ROV footage, remotely operated vehicles had filmed the summit in detail. They observed features that resembled ancient beaches and sand dunes. The multi-beam bathymetry, which is a sonar method that maps the sea floor in 3 dimensions, showed ripple patterns and sediment layers, consistent with wave action and coastal deposition. These are exactly the kinds of patterns geologists expect to see where water once met land. The questions that followed were precise and scientific. When were these summits last above the surface? How long ago? What can the sediment tell us about sea levels in the past? But the moment those images entered the public realm, the conversation shifted. Media outlets ran with headlines. Here was a submerged landform. Here was evidence of a sunken coast. And here, some claimed, was the physical proof of Atlantis itself. A lost city, drowned beneath the waves, waiting to be rediscovered. Luis Somoza, the lead researcher on the project, found himself in an unexpected position. He had conducted rigorous science. His team had gathered data methodically. They had offered careful, qualified language in their initial reports. This is what we observed. This is what it might indicate. Here is what requires further investigation. Within days, Somoza watched his cautious wording reshaped into sensational claims. Every news cycle seemed to pull the story further from geology and deeper into speculation. Local authorities and media outlets pressed him for definitive answers. Was this Atlantis or wasn't it? Officials wanted a headline they could use. The public wanted certainty. But Luis knew something crucial. Science doesn't work backward from a desired conclusion. You don't start with a legend and then hunt for evidence to fit it. That's not how the process works. So he began scheduling rapid internal briefings with his team, determined to preempt further misquotes. He delayed any speculative commentary until peer review was complete. His behavior shifted from openness to guardedness, not out of secrecy, but out of a need to protect the integrity of the work itself.
The discovery of Los Atlantes raised a fundamental question. When a geological finding can be framed in multiple ways, who decides which frame prevails? And what did the instruments actually record? And how did that recording become a bridge to myth? When a new discovery emerges, it doesn't arrive into empty space. It lands in a world already full of stories, assumptions, and centuries-old ideas about what remote places might hold. Today, we're looking at how old myths and modern maps collide, and what happens when a real scientific finding gets pulled into that collision.
Open a Victorian atlas from the 1800s. Look at the western edge of the Atlantic. You'll find clusters of islands marked with careful labels, their positions shifting slightly from one edition to the next. Atlantis, the Hesperides, the Fortunate Isles. Classical and Roman writers have positioned legendary Atlantic islands at the world's boundary for centuries, places where civilization gave way to mystery and possibility. That symbolic geography mattered. When European explorers began charting actual Atlantic islands, the Canaries, Madeira, the Azores, they arrived already primed to see them through a particular lens. These were edges, they were thresholds, and into that imaginative space, travelers and atlas makers began projecting their own hopes and fears. By the Victorian era, something shifted. As imperial powers mapped the globe more thoroughly, remote island populations became subjects of intense scrutiny and exoticization. Writers and scholars spun elaborate theories about their origins. Some claimed evidence for lost civilizations. Others layered in pseudo-scientific ideas about human ancestry and racial categories that reflected the prejudices of their own era, not the actual history of island peoples. The islands themselves, and the people who lived there, became containers for whatever narrative outsiders wanted to project.
This is where Ricardo Rodríguez-Varela enters the story.
Ricardo has spent years working on the genetics of the Guanche, the indigenous population of the Canary Islands. His research is meticulous, grounded in DNA evidence and careful interpretation. But he's also a historian, watching his work move through public space, and he knows the cultural weight these islands carry. He has seen 19th century racial theories persist in modern popular accounts. He has watched sensational framings eclipse the lived histories of real people. That experience created a protective instinct in him. When new discoveries surface, like a deep-sea seamount with an intriguing shape, Ricardo felt a duty to ensure they were explained with evidence, not rumor or cultural stereotype. The mechanism of escalation is not mysterious. Images travel fast, maps carry authority, language shapes what we see. A Victorian atlas caption suggesting lost islands at the world's edge, a modern satellite image of underwater terrain, a 24-hour news cycle hungry for narrative. These elements combine, each one lends credibility to the next. And once that momentum builds, the older tropes supply a ready-made symbolic vocabulary. The remote place becomes not only a scientific object, but a cultural totem, already freighted with centuries of meaning before any journalist or commentator adds a single word. Ricardo's frustration wasn't with science itself. It was with watching careful interpretation get overshadowed by sensational frames, and with recognizing the historical pattern repeating. He began to shift how he engaged publicly, emphasizing rigorous methodology in lectures and working with local cultural institutions to correct narratives that misrepresented both the science and the people. It was not enough to know the truth. The truth had to be defended against the weight of older, more emotionally resonant stories.
So when maps and cultural anxieties meet, what gets projected onto a real place and people? So far, we've explored why the Canary Islands captured imaginations, the myths, the stories, the hunger for lost civilizations. But imagination alone doesn't settle history. Now, we meet the people whose job is to look past legend and let evidence speak. Meet the geneticists and geologists who study the Guanche.
In a lab somewhere in northern Europe, a centrifuge whirs. A scientist leans over a workbench, carefully extracting a vial of amber-colored liquid. Inside are fragments of DNA pulled from bones that spent centuries buried in island soil. These molecules carry a story older than any written record. A story about where people came from, how they moved, and who their ancestors were. Linus Girdland-Flink is one of those researchers. He's a geneticist who spent years analyzing human remains recovered from the Canary Islands. His work didn't start with grand theories or island mysteries. It started with a question. What does the DNA actually tell us about who the Guanche were and where they came from? When Linus and his colleagues published their genome-wide analysis in 2017, the findings were clear. The ancient DNA from Guanche remains showed the strongest genetic connection to modern North African populations, particularly groups related to Berber ancestry. The data didn't support theories of lost civilizations or isolated survivors. It pointed instead to a migration pattern, people who came from Northwest Africa and settled the islands over time.
But publishing a study is only half the story.
What Linus discovered early on was that releasing this data came with weight. Local communities, scholars, and the public all had invested interest in understanding the Guanche story. Some people wanted the DNA to confirm exotic narratives. Others had genuine questions about their own heritage. Linus realized that being a careful scientist meant more than publishing numbers in peer-reviewed journals. It meant having honest conversations about what the evidence could and couldn't prove. He began collaborating with regional experts and communities before releasing findings. He took time to explain what genetic analysis actually measures: ancestry, migration routes, population mixing, and where its limits lie. He also made clear what the data could not do. It could not confirm or deny spiritual beliefs, cultural identity, or the richness of Guanche history. The DNA was one voice among many. Linus was not alone in bringing scientific rigor to the islands. Geologists and oceanographers were mapping the seafloor, studying sediment cores and dating volcanic events. Their instruments, multi-beam sonar, radiocarbon measurements, seafloor cameras, were seeing what no legend could see: the actual geological history of the archipelago, layer by layer. These researchers understood something crucial. Evidence doesn't arrive as drama or revelation. It accumulates. A fossil in one layer, a grain of pollen in another, a shift in radiocarbon dates, each piece small, but together they form a picture far more detailed than any myth.
So, what do genetics and geology actually tell us about the Guanche, and what do they not? So far, we've heard the story of discovery, the sonar images, the seamount, the excitement. But here's the hard part. How do you actually prove that a sunken landform was once exposed to humans? The answer lies in methods, and methods matter more than the pictures.
On the research vessel's deck, a team of technicians cluster around a laptop, watching lines of sonar data scroll across the screen. The multi-beam bathymetry, that's the detailed seafloor map, shows a shape that's intriguing, a summit with features that resemble terraces, ridges, and what look like old beach lines. But here's the problem. A shape isn't a date. To know when something was above water, you need sediment cores. Luis Somoza and his team deploy a drilling apparatus that bites down through layers of mud and sand on the seafloor, pulling up a cylinder of compressed time. Each layer tells a story: what lived there, what the ocean was doing, when storms or floods reset the record. But the core alone is silent. You have to read it. In a shore lab, technicians wash the core samples with delicate hands, removing salt and sediment. They examine the grains under magnification, noting color changes, fossils, shells, anything that marks a shift in environment. Then they select samples for radiometric dating, a process that counts the decay of radioactive isotopes to assign an absolute age to the material.
Why does this step take so long?
Because Luis knows that dating a shoreline requires precision. If the core shows sand above marine mud, it might suggest an ancient beach. But when did that beach form? Was it during a lower sea level thousands of years ago? Or millions? Radiometric dates anchor the speculation to a real number, and that number has a margin of error. Some samples yield ages from the Eocene epoch, roughly 56 to 34 million years ago, when the Los Atlantes seamount was likely an island before volcanic and geological processes submerged it. But other dates point to more recent times, or remain ambiguous. Meanwhile, in another facility, geneticists are working with tiny bone fragments recovered near the seamount. DNA analysis checking if genetic material is modern or ancient. If it matches known species or represents something unexpected, requires sterile technique and multiple rounds of confirmation. The bones are cleaned, samples are extracted, and machines run overnight, amplifying and sequencing the genetic code. Days pass before results come back. And when they do, the question is always the same. Does this bone link to the timeline we're investigating? For Luis, the pressure is mounting. He's had to defend the technical scope of the ROV missions against oversimplified readings in the media. Journalists ask why the team hasn't already announced a human settlement. The public wants narrative. They want proof of occupation, evidence of artifact, validation of the myth. But Luis feels the weight of responsibility differently. He's committed to returning clear datasets for peer review, even if clarity means saying we don't know yet. That commitment has shifted his priorities. He's now pushing for additional coring campaigns, and he's documenting sampling protocols in greater detail so that any public release reflects the reality of how evidence is built, not the fantasy of how it's sometimes imagined. An ROV descends into the deep, its lights illuminating coral gardens and bacterial mats that have colonized the seamount slopes. Sand ripples pattern the deeper terrain, and in some places, what might be cave mouths open into shadow. The images are beautiful and strange, but none of them alone can tell you whether humans ever walked this ground.
So when does a geological or genetic signature actually become evidence for a human-era event? When a discovery breaks across social media, something shifts. The evidence hasn't changed, but the story spreads like wildfire. Today, we listen to the believers, the people drawn to a mystery, and we ask, why does an island that sank thousands of years ago feel so urgent to find?
Picture the shore at dusk. Waves lap against volcanic rock. The light catches basalt cliffs, their surfaces dark and layered, telling stories written in stone. Nearby, sand stretches pale and ordinary, the meeting of fire and water, ancient and immediate. This is where legends take hold, where the eye sees a shape and the mind fills in the rest. When the seamount was mapped and named, podcasters and travel writers seized on the resemblance to Plato's account. Some claimed IGME's discovery of Los Atlantis was the physical remains of the civilization Plato described in his dialogues. Others went further, proposing that the Guanche people, the original inhabitants of the islands, were direct descendants of Plato's advanced Atlantean civilization. These ideas flooded social feeds within days, images circulated, hashtags multiplied, the hunger for confirmation became its own kind of evidence.
And that hunger, where does it come from?
Visual resemblance is seductive. A formation looks like something, and that likeness bypasses chronology. It bypasses the painstaking work of matching geological timescales to human history. The believer narratives relied on what the eye seemed to show, not on when things actually happened. Fringe authors, popular podcasters, and travel writers moved faster than peer review ever could. Their tone was vivid, emotional, rooted in images rather than evidence. When human longing collides with scientific time, longing wins the headlines. Ricardo Rodríguez-Varela watched this unfold. His careful genetic work, the kind that takes years, that involves collaboration with communities, that demands precision, became framed as contradiction rather than clarification. Every time he presented his findings, people online asked, "If this isn't Atlantis, why did you study it?" The exasperation built. Ricardo felt protective of something larger than his own research, the integrity of the islands themselves, the heritage of the Guanche people, the authority of community voices being drowned out by sensational claims.
So what changed?
Ricardo began spending more time on public platforms, pushing back against misreadings in real time. He started collaborating directly with local cultural stakeholders to amplify their own voices and perspectives. His behavior shifted out of necessity. Once a false certainty gains momentum on social feeds, travel plans align with it, souvenir designs follow, research priorities shift. Local communities find their own stories secondary to a manufactured narrative. The correction, Ricardo understood, couldn't wait for the next peer-reviewed journal. This is the weight that unchecked belief carries. It isn't harmless enthusiasm. It reshapes heritage. It redirects tourism. It drowns out the people whose actual connection to these islands runs deep.
The believers have spoken. Now we turn to the skeptics and the methods that dismantle quick claims, genetic results, geological evidence, classical scholarship. Why does the image of a sunken shore become a story people want to believe? We've heard the believers. We've seen how quickly myth can attach to an image. Now we turn to the skeptics, not to dismiss wonder, but to ask, what does the evidence actually show? When a scientist sits down with a dramatic claim, the first question is always the same. Can you prove it?
A scientist states clearly, "Show me a Holocene date for subaerial exposure and human occupation, and we'll talk." The microphone stays on as the silence underlines the demand for proof. This is where myth meets method. The claims around Los Atlantis and the Canary Islands rest on a chain of assumptions. First, that a seamount off the African coast holds the physical remains of Atlantis as Plato described it. Second, that the Guanche people, the indigenous inhabitants of the islands, represent a lost Atlantic civilization. Third, that modern genetic evidence somehow validates this narrative. Each claim faces a different test. Start with the geology. Researchers at IGMI have interpreted Los Atlantis as Eocene in origin, meaning the rocks themselves formed roughly 50 million years ago, far predating any human era. That's a problem for anyone arguing it was a sunken human settlement. Radiometric dating, core samples, and stratigraphic analysis all point in the same direction. This seamount is ancient geology, not recent history.
So the physical geography doesn't support the Atlantis reading.
No, the timeline is simply incompatible. Now turn to genetics. In 2017, Liverpool John Moores University released findings on Guanche ancestry based on ancient DNA analysis. The results were clear. The Guanche were descended from northwest African populations, specifically Berber groups, from across the Mediterranean coast. This is solid science, replicated and published. But here's where public perception diverged sharply from the data. Linus Girdland-Flink had to repeatedly clarify that genetic links show regional ancestry, not mythic lineage. He felt relief when database narratives replaced speculation in academic circles. But he was alarmed by public misunderstandings that treated genetics as a cultural verdict, as if knowing a people's ancestors automatically confirmed or disproved their own historical narratives. The science says, the Guanche came from North Africa. That is ancestral geography. It is not a claim about Atlantis.
So genetics actually answers the ancestry question, but not the Atlantis question.
Exactly. The checklist is simple. To treat a seamount or a people as evidence for an ancient civilizational narrative, you need multiple gates to pass. Holocene dates for human occupation. Subaerial exposure timelines that match settlement periods. Peer-reviewed geological consensus. Genome-wide ancient DNA replication that rules out contamination. Linus now prioritizes straightforward public summaries in press releases, working with historians to contextualize genetic findings. Because the data itself is honest, but the stories people build from it can drift far from what the evidence shows. Until those gates open, the dramatic claim remains unsupported.
Which empirical tests remain unmet if we want to treat a seamount or a people as evidence for an ancient civilizational narrative? When a story about the past circulates widely enough, it stops being just information. It becomes part of how people see themselves and their place in the world. Today, we're looking at what happens after the headlines fade and who bears the cost when cultural history gets rewritten for spectacle.
On the Canary Islands, the landscape tells a story in stone and soil. Black basalt cliffs rise from the coast. Terraced fields scar the volcanic slopes, evidence of people who learned to farm on difficult terrain. Cave mouths open into hillsides, where communities once lived and died. This is the material record of the Guanche, the indigenous people of these islands before Spanish conquest. But for decades, sensational narratives overshadowed these facts. Atlantis myths, claims about lost white civilizations, diffusion theories that erased local agency. All of it competed with careful archaeology for attention and funding. The Guanche became a blank canvas onto which outsiders projected their own fascinations, their real history, a society adapted to island life, with practices and material culture consistent with Northwest African origins, got buried under speculation. Ricardo Rodríguez-Varela has spent years watching how this plays out. Working with local museums and cultural institutions, Ricardo witnesses the aftermath. Communities on Tenerife and Gran Canaria have had their identities reinterpreted by outsiders for generations. When viral headlines spread myths as discovery, it shapes tourism infrastructure, heritage funding priorities, even how young people understand their own ancestry.
What does that pressure look like on the ground?
Ricardo has witnessed communities organizing to demand heritage protections after sensational coverage triggered extractive tourism and development pressure. Museums received grants to display speculation rather than evidence. Local scholars found it harder to secure funding for rigorous, community-led research. The cost was real. Resources diverted away from scholarship that would actually deepen understanding and uplift local narratives. Correcting the record, debunking the Atlantis claim, clarifying the archaeology was necessary, but it was not enough. Clearing a misconception does not erase its reverberations. This is where Ricardo's work shifted. Rather than simply publishing corrections, he began partnering with cultural institutions to ensure the community narratives were foregrounded in public-facing displays. He advocates for funding structures that support priorities set by local researchers and community members themselves. It is slower work than a viral headline. It requires listening. It requires sharing authority over how heritage is presented. But it creates the possibility that wonder and rigorous truth-telling can move together. The Guanche sites, the caves, the terraced fields, the islands themselves, hold genuine mysteries. How did communities adapt to volcanic terrain? What were the social structures that sustained island life? These questions are as compelling as any myth. They just require patience, respect for evidence, and genuine engagement with the people whose heritage is at stake.
The central question, then, becomes one about responsibility. how should scientists, media, and communities share responsibility when discovery headlines reshape cultural life? We've traced a story from myth to science, from Plato's words to seafloor surveys and DNA. But as we close, the real question isn't what we've proven, it's what we choose to do with what we know. The evidence is clear now. The Guanche came from northwest Africa, and those underwater formations rose and fell long before any human civilization could have called them home.
But standing at the ocean's edge, listening to the long fetch waves roll in, you can understand why the story held such power. Humans have always looked at mystery and asked, what if? It's not wrong to wonder. The harm comes when wonder becomes certainty, and certainty becomes erasure. Luis Somoza knows this weight now. He's rebuilt how his research team approaches each discovery, not just asking what the data shows, but who gets to tell that story and whose voice gets centered when the media arrives. It's a quieter kind of rigor, but it matters. The seamounts formed in deep geologic time, millions of years before humans set foot on the Canary Islands. The Guanche traced their ancestry to the Maghreb coast. These aren't failures of science. They're how science corrects itself when evidence speaks clearly.
What's harder is the next step.
When you hear a headline about a discovery, ask who conducted the research and who benefits from the story being told a certain way. Ask whether island communities had a voice in how the findings were framed. Support scientists who engage with local cultural knowledge before rushing to press. And when you feel that pull toward the grand narrative, the lost city, the buried truth, pause. Notice the feeling, but also notice the people whose real histories might be overshadowed by someone else's myth. Wonder doesn't have to die when a claim falls apart, but it has to grow up. It has to make room for the actual stories, the navigation routes, the agricultural knowledge, the resilience of real people adapting to island life. Those stories are older and deeper than any imagined city. The ocean still holds secrets. New discoveries will come, and when they do, the question won't be whether they're sensational enough to capture attention. It will be whether we have the discipline and care to let the evidence and the people tell their truth together.
So here's what remains. Can science allow room for wonder without repeating the harms of colonial myth-making?